Now, in 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment, which really had been proposed about 50 years earlier by Alice Paul, had languished in Congress. Namely, it had been proposed but never acted on. And now it's actually going to pass Congress. Once it passes Congress, it actually needs to be ratified by three-fourths of the 50 states. So the magic number is 38. Now, the wording in the Equal Rights Amendment is actually very, very simple. It says, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Again, to women's rights activists, this seemed like getting 38 states to ratify it would not actually be that hard. But obviously, this is going to be different. This is not going to be like getting a law passed, because now this is going to be for each state to actually decide. So what they're going to do is they're going to target, specific states to try to get this passed. So marches are staged in key states. You bring out hundreds of thousands of supporters. You've got your sort of, really classic, like you're going for, to elect somebody. So you go, you have meetings at houses, you have walkathons, you have door-to-door canvassing, and every kind of event imaginable, done by just not politicians, but by ordinary women who were trying to get, enough people within their state. Again, it's not actually the people; it would be the people lobbying their state legislature. So it has to actually be 38 state legislatures that support this. And you've got women's magazines and all other sorts of publications that are talking about the ERA and its potential benefits. But while you would think, by 1972 it might not be terribly challenging to get this passed, you've got to go back to think about all of the resistance that women's suffrage faced, particularly from many women who were, far more traditional and conservative, and were scared about what potentially could happen if women were given, that independence to be able to vote. You even remember sort of that talk about, oh my God, divorce rates will go up and women will leave their husbands and all of that. Now, what we need to know is that the main opposition to the ERA was led by a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, who had an organization called the Eagle Forum, and her goal was to, quote, stop ERA. In her mind, she thought that this was an effort to dismantle the foundation of American society, especially the family. And she actually said, the ERA has a hidden agenda, quote unquote, taxpayer funding of abortions and the entire gay rights agenda. Now, again, this idea of the gay rights agenda is something that is sort of going on at the same time after the Stonewall Rebellion. But at the same time, what she's also arguing is that she says women aren't being discriminated against at all. She says that they actually have a very special position in American society through the sort of old, Christian tradition of chivalry. So if you go back, in some ways, she's really sort of drawing upon this idea of like Republican motherhood and the cult of domesticity and separate spheres, that in fact women have a special place. And if you try to sort of force the ERA down people's throat, you're going to undo that. She also famously argued that if the ERA was passed, men would leave their families, we'd ultimately see unisex toilets, you'd see an increase in gay marriage, you'd see women being drafted in the military. And again, the media, which is going to try to be balanced, gave, equal weight to these arguments, just as they had when, there was a possibility of women being, getting voting rights debated way back in the early 1900s. And just like happened with women's suffrage, there were still very few women in state legislatures to voice their support. So, if you had women in the state that were trying to lobby their, state Congress men and very few women, it ended up being men in the legislatures who were deciding if women would ultimately get this power. And so by 1982, because the deadline for this kept getting extended and extended, so it gets passed in 72, and it takes over 10 years. In 1982, sort of the deadline hit, and the ERA was 3 votes short of 38. So it got to 35, never got to 38. And now, while 75% of the women lawmakers, so if, there weren't that many women lawmakers in the states, but 75% of them, supported the ERA, but only 46 of the men in these state legislatures voted to ratify. And that's where you get the numbers where, in the end, 35 out of the necessary 38 voted for it. And, despite polls that consistently showed a large majority of the American population supporting the ERA, many politicians just thought it would be too controversial. So something that starts with Alice Paul way back in the 1920s gets brought back in 72, really dies by 1982. The next big thing we're going to talk about is women's reproductive rights. Now, the Food and Drug Administration approves the first oral contraceptive in 1960, aka the pill. Yet the pill is not available to married women in all states until a famous case in 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut. And then again, it's not available to unmarried women in all states until 1972 in a case called Eisenstadt v. Baird. Now, once we see that women are able to get these oral contraceptives, they now know that they can, go through school and in college and graduate school and launch their careers without necessarily being interrupted by pregnancy, as women always had up until that point. So you see, again, along with Title IX, a huge increase in women applying to medical, law, business schools. And you're also going to see at the same time this idea of a sexual revolution, because women can now have premarital sex. And men were always able to do this, and again, women could become pregnant, but sort of they could say, not my problem. But now women can do it as well, and sort of it's incredibly liberating and really a source of great independence. Now, there's going to be a magazine that gets started. So just as sort of there's, the feminine mystique in 63, you're going to see a movie called a magazine called Ms. Magazine, MS period, that debuts in 1972. And it really becomes sort of the up-to-date mouthpiece for the movement at that point. And it seemed to be a voice for women, by women, and they feel that the mainstream media has really, silenced them for so long, and it's their opportunity. The reason that we bring it up in terms of reproductive rights is their first famous publication. The first issue was articles about women who'd had experience with abortions, and so it was sort of very eye-opening in terms of what they're talking about. This is 72, the year before Roe v. Wade in 73. So when we talk about abortion, we have to keep in mind that going back in the 60s, in 1965, for example, illegal abortions made up 1/6 of all pregnancy and childbirth-related deaths. And the reason that we bring this up is that there were many states that didn't allow women to get abortions. So what they were doing was they were going to what were actually called back alley abortionists, doctors who were sort of operating in sketchy ways, or in fact people that weren't actually physicians at all. And if you wanted to terminate a pregnancy, you either sort of tried to do it yourself, which turned out to be incredibly problematic and oftentimes gruesome, or you went to these people that certainly didn't always know what they were doing. So again, in 73, the year after Ms. Magazine has published its first issue, and 10 years after, we're going to see the feminine mystique. In early 1973, the Supreme Court hands down what is truly one of the most landmark decisions in U.S. history, Roe versus Wade, which says the constitutional right to privacy. Now they use a number of different amendments. They actually use the 1st, the 4th, the 5th, the 19th, the 14th, but really famously, the first, the right to privacy, and 4th, extends to a woman's right to make her own personal medical decisions. If she wants to have an abortion, she can have an abortion without interference from politicians. Now, it doesn't necessarily say that you can have an abortion at any time. It says that states cannot limit it during the first trimester. Other states may allow it sort of beyond that first trimester, and then after Roe versus Wade in 73, you're going to see many states that actually try to sort of scale it back over time. Now, Roe versus Wade really is considered to be, the crowning achievement in terms of the women's rights movement, that second wave of feminism. But you're also going to see some other noteworthy events that really draw attention to discrimination, to the disparity in pay, to the mistreatment of women. And one of those is something that's actually called the Battle of the Sexes. Believe it or not, it was a highly publicized televised tennis match. And it involved a guy named Bobby Riggs, who'd been one of the world's top players of the 1940s, and he'd won a bunch of titles in his career, and then he retired in the early 50s. But he also was sort of a shameless self-promoter, and so really 20 years after he was last relevant, he made this bold statement that the female tennis game was inferior, and that even in his mid-50s, he could beat even the top players. And so he takes on the top women's player, Billie Jean King, at the Houston Astrodome, which is this enormous cavernous facility. And in fact, Billie Jean King wins. And it's a lot of hoopla and again, a lot of pomp and circumstance, but the match attracts massive attention, and there's like 90 million people who watch it, and it's seen as a major milestone, not only just in the acceptance of women's tennis and women's sports, but just overall in terms of showing that women can compete with men. Now, earlier, the match happened in 1973. I'm going to go back about 5 years to the Miss America pageant, and there was a pretty famous protest called the Miss America protest, and it's sort of all about the idea of Miss America is wrong for any number of reasons. And the complaints were, listen, that this whole idea of Miss America is an unreasonable and impossible standard of beauty, and that this objectification of women in the pageant actually harms all women. They argue that it's racist because there's never been a black Miss America. The activists are actually against the Vietnam War. Again, many people that were activists for civil rights were overall against the Vietnam War. And one of the interesting things about the winner of the Vietnam War was they got to go to Vietnam to entertain the troops, which they thought was crazy. And they argue, what kind of message are you sending to young girls? You say that a young boy can grow up to be president, but a young girl's going to need to grow up to be Miss America. And at the time, Miss America was a very big deal. Now it's really not. But so in 1968, when they protest, and there's people in the ceremony, in the pageant, and there's a live broadcast, and they have this huge protest inside the hall. In fact, inside and outside the hall, it really does bring attention to what women are fighting for. And again, in sort of a more academic sense, you're going to see at that point in time, there's the first women's studies department begins at San Diego State. There's a women's studies program at Cornell. This mirrors what is actually happening in the African American civil rights movement, where there's push at colleges to have African American studies being taught as well.